Okay, thanks a lot, Chris, and I'll give you a shout as the slides go along. So this talk is inspired by this excellent book, The Complete Poetry of George Orwell, edited by Dinah Venables, our founder. And this is a must-have possession for all Orwellians, particularly as I believe that the proceeds from the sales of the book go to the Orwell Society. It was a really good idea to bring together Orwell's complete poetry. Dinah has done a heroic job in finding 42 Orwell poems in his work. Some of them are slightly marginal. For example, she prints a rhyming advertisement from Keep the Aspidistra Flying. And she very interestingly also prints a chunk of prose from 1984 in the form of a poem, an interesting experiment. But among them, she includes this poem, St. Andrew's Day. So next slide, please, Chris, if you would. This poem was published in the Adelphi in November 1935, but it also features, in a way, this is the most interesting aspect of it. It also features in the novel Keep the Aspidistra Flying, published the following year, 1936. So I'm going to read through it now, then I'll talk about it, and if we've got time, I'll read it again at the end. St. Andrew's Day, 1935. Sharply the menacing wind sweeps over the bending poplars, newly bare, and the dark ribbons of the chimneys veer downward, flicked by whips of air. Torn posters flutter, coldly sound the boom of trams and the rattle of hooves, and the clerks who hurry to the station look shuddering over the eastern roofs, thinking each one, here comes the winter. Please God, I keep my job this year. And bleakly, as the cold strikes through their entrails like an icy spear, they think of rent, rates, season tickets, insurance, coal, the skivvy's wages, boots, school bills, and the next installment upon the 2 twin beds from Drages. For if in careless summer days and groves of Ashtaroth we hoard, repentant now when winds blow cold, we kneel before our rightful Lord, the Lord of all, the money God, who rules us blood and hand and brain, who gives the roof that stops the wind and giving takes away again, who spies with jealous, watchful care our thoughts, our dreams, our secret ways, who picks our words and cuts our clothes and maps the pattern of our days, who chills our anger, curbs our hope, and buys our lives and pays with toys, who claims as tribute broken faith, accepted insults, muted joys, who binds with chains the poet's wit, the navvy's strength, the soldier's pride, and lays the sleek, estranging shield between the lover and his bride. I think this is a terrific poem, actually. First of all, I think we would say, what's this poem about? It's a poem of the modern world. It's a poem about modernity, particularly the modern city, and it's recognizably the city of London, where Gordon Comstock works. In fact, as a poem of the modern world about modernity, we could probably call it modernist. And it has its roots, I would say, in the heroes of the generation before Orwell and Gordon Comstock. Next slide, if you would, Chris. The great modernist, the great sort of Anglo-American or Anglo-Atlantic modernist writers. And I would choose 2 of these in particular, James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, both very important figures for Orwell. Joyce, probably best known for his great novel Ulysses, published in 1922. But before that, his first novel was called A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and he published that in 1916. And I think in one particular way, it's a very important antecedent for Orwell's poem. Then T.S. Eliot, known, even notorious, for his great poem, The Wasteland, and this is published in the same year as Ulysses. A poem about many things, but one of the things it's about is the city of London, where Eliot, of course, worked in a bank, with lines like, unreal city, under the round fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many, I had not thought death had undone so many, And it's this picture of London commuters is something that Orwell is replicating, I think, in the first part of his poem. So these two, I would say, are in some respects the ancestors of Orwell's poetry. They would both have been very recognizable figures to the readers of the Adelphi, where the poem was first published. And they both had a reputation, though this changed later, they had a reputation as difficult writers, experimental, radical, formally radical, and also culturally pessimistic. And these things, I think, feed into the poem that Orwell was writing. Next one, please, Chris. The Wasteland in particular was really the great anthem of Orwell's generation. The people who'd grown up in the 1920s looked to Eliot as the great modernist poet, in spite of the fact that for older and more traditional readers, Eliot was a bit of a problem. Some people thought he was incomprehensible. Some people thought his poetry wasn't really poetic. Some of you may recollect in Evelyn Waugh's novel, Brideshead Revisited, it's published in 1945, there's quite a funny scene in which the students at Oxford, undergraduates at an Oxford college, are having lunch together in the rooms of one of them. One of the people there is a high aesthete, very camp aesthete called Anthony Blanche. And here he is in the picture, I think it's from the TV Brideshead. After luncheon, Anthony Blanche stood on the balcony with a megaphone, which had appeared surprisingly among the bric-a-brac of Sebastian's room. And in languishing, sobbing tones, he recited passages from the Wasteland to the sweated and muffled throng that was on its way to the river. I, Tiresias, have foresuffered all, he sobbed to them from the Venetian arches. So this is an indication of the enormous, almost cult status of T.S. Eliot, and particularly the Wasteland. And also, I think, of the way it acts as there's a kind of antagonism. Anthony Blanche is reciting it from the balcony in order to tease or provoke all these sporting jocks who are heading to row on the river, who presumably wouldn't give T.S. Eliot the time of day. So Eliot and Joyce are the godparents, I think, of the young Orwell as a writer. Now, as for this poem, we know from a letter to Brenda Salkeld that Orwell wrote it in order to be included in the novel. He didn't write it as a standalone and then stick it into the novel. He composed it with the idea of it playing the part that it plays in Keep the Aspidistra Flying. Diney, in her book, I quote from Diney's book.
Your sound's disappeared a bit.
Because I turned away from the microphone. Is that better?
Yeah, that's
better. Okay. She says, the third novel, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, published in 1936, the book hosts a poem. I think that's a very nice way of putting it. The book hosts a poem that evolves slowly through its pages, beginning with one shy little two-line couplet on page 5, and then growing verse by verse in every chapter, finally emerging in its entirety on page 167. And she says, this is a unique and fascinating way to present a poem, involving the reader at every point of its evolution. And she's absolutely right that it's fascinating, but it's not actually unique. The idea of including the composition of a poem in a novel about a young poet had already been tried out by James Joyce in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. In the last long chapter of that book, where we see the hero, Stephen Dedalus, an aspiring young writer, composing, just as Gordon Comstock later does, stanza by stanza, a poem which he then completes in the later pages of the novel. So this is actually another tribute, if you like, to the godparents of modernism, in Orwell, who had already cannibalized Joyce in a sense. If you remember in A Clergyman's Daughter, in the chapter about Trafalgar Square, Orwell uses the techniques that Joyce himself had used in Ulysses, the sort of dramatic, filmic, surrealist techniques. That's another tribute, a partially successful one. So in these respects, Orwell's poem is a high modernist poem. It's a portrait of the artist in modernity, and it includes the fashionable cultural pessimism. I don't mean to say insincere, but the fashionable cultural pessimism about modernity, about the bleakness and sterility of the modern world that he found in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and in Joyce's fiction. But that's not the end of the story, because if you remember his later essay, Inside the Whale, in that great essay, he produces a literary history of his own lifetime. And he divides he makes a distinction between the literature of the 1920s and the literature of the 1930s in England and in America. And he says the writers of the 1920s, these would include Joyce and Eliot and others, that they were great writers, but their weakness was that they weren't interested in politics. All the political events of the 1920s just passed them by, says Orwell. They were only interested in the aesthetic. Now, I don't actually agree with that judgment, but it's an interesting one. And then, says Orwell, the next generation came along. This is Orwell's own generation. And they, in contrast, were very interested in politics. And they tended to have left-wing allegiances and to pay attention to social conditions and to have a political message in their work. Next slide, please, Chris. And these are the poets around W.H. Auden, who's pictured there on the left. I think this was taken in Venice. So Auden is on the left. Cecil Day-Lewis, the father, I think, of the actor Daniel Day-Lewis, in the middle. And on the right, Stephen Spender. These are Orwell's own contemporaries. And they were, he's right to say, that at least in the 1930s, these writers tended to be politically committed. They tended to be left-wing. They were less interested in aesthetic experiments of the kind practiced by Joyce and Eliot and that generation, and more interested in using their poetry as a kind of activism. And Orwell himself, I think, is poised between the two at this stage in his career. Remember, he hasn't been to Wigan yet. He's not sure what kind of a writer he wants to be. Does he want to be an aesthetic literary writer like Joyce and Eliot, or does he want to be a politically committed activist writer like his own contemporaries, Auden, Day-Lewis and Spender, about whom, as we know, he had rather mixed views. And I would suggest that this poem, St. Andrew's Day, actually enacts that sort of indecision about what kind of a writer he wanted to be, what kind of a poem he wanted to produce. The poem, St. Andrew's Day, moves outward, as the novel does, from the particular world of the novel, from the world of Gordon Comstock, the recognizable world apprehended by his senses. So, for example, we have in the early lines the naked poplars and the torn poster. These are images that appear in the first chapter of Orwell's novel, Keep the Aspidistra Flying. So he's clearly referring to the world of Gordon Comstock. But later on in the poem, he moves to more Auden-esque material, to take a more political stance, particularly in the critical mood of the last stanzas, where he's complaining about the tyranny of the money god and how the money god deforms the lives of all citizens in capitalism, a word he doesn't actually use. So the poem ends with a powerful vision of an absolutist tyranny. Of course, that's where he's heading, isn't it? 1984, a vision of absolutist tyranny. So in one respect, this poem, and indeed the novel, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, is an anticipation of 1984. I think we tend to think of these things as belonging to very separate worlds, but I think there are strong connections between the two. And if we see the next quote, please, Chris, I can explain what I mean by this. This is a moment in the novel, late-ish in the novel, chapter 7, where Gordon Comstock has been walking the streets. He's still trying to work out the poem that is going to become St. Andrew's Day. He's nearly finished it. but he can't get the ending. And this is what happens to him. Something deep below made the stone street shiver. He's out, as he so often is in this novel, he's out of doors at this point. The tube train sliding through Middle Earth. He had a vision of London, of the Western world. He saw 1,000 million slaves toiling and groveling about the throne of money. The earth is plowed, ships sail, miners sweat in dripping tunnels underground, clerks hurry for the 8:15 with the fear of the boss eating at their vitals. And even in bed with their wives, they tremble and obey. Obey whom? The money priesthood, the pink-faced masters of the world, the upper crust, a welter of sleek young rabbits in 1,000-guinea motor cars, of golfing stockbrokers and cosmopolitan financiers, of chancery lawyers and fashionable Nancy boys, of bankers, newspaper peers, novelists of all four sexes, American pugilists, lady aviators, film stars, bishops, title poets, and Chicago gorillas. When he had gone another 50 yards, the rhyme for the final stanza of his poem occurred to him. He walked homeward, repeating the poem to himself. And this is a kind of Proustian moment where he's actually managed to finish the poem through meditating on London and what it means to him. And I think this is a serious moment, actually, in the novel, and indeed in Orwell's development. He had a vision of London, and immediately it expands, a vision of London of the Western world. He saw 1,000 million slaves toiling and groveling about the throne of money. We move up from the metropolis into the empire, but it's a capitalist empire. It's an empire of money and exploitation. Remember what Orwell said about slaves. He said, think about the slaves of antiquity. How many of them could you name? We don't remember their names. They've just disappeared. They've been slaving away and groveling about the throne of money. So this is a vision of an absolutist tyranny, and it anticipates 1984. It reminds us, I think, of the connection between this novel, this poem, and Orwell's final masterpiece. And it reminds me that the regime of Big Brother is based, I think, on three things from Orwell's experience. First of all, most obviously, his observation of totalitarian regimes in the 1930s and 40s of Hitler and Stalin. Secondly, his experience of imperialism in Burma, which I'm not talking about today, but which is enormously important for creating his political vision. And thirdly, his socialist critique of capitalism, which is sort of emerging here in aesthetic form, in his vision of London, of the Western world. Okay, next one, please, Chris. I'm going to go back to the poem and just go through it and pick out a few points, and then we'll be done. St. Andrew's Day, 1935. Peter Davison is not sure that Orwell composed this title for the poem, and says it might have been stuck on the poem by the editors at Adelphi. I don't find that very convincing. I don't think they would have supplied such a specific title to a poem without going past Orwell. So I think it's him. St. Andrew's Day, the 30th of November, is the last day of autumn, the last day before December, which is why the clerks rushing to the station, their first thought is, here comes the winter. So it's the end of autumn, the beginning of winter. If you think of what autumn means to poets, autumn is a very romantic season in poetry, a season of plenitude, but also of melancholy. John Keats's great Ode to Autumn, one of the most famous poems of the Romantic tradition. So in a sense, Orwell's poem starts from there, but then turns its back on Romanticism, the autumn of Romanticism, and turns its face towards the winter of the modern. The form of the poem is in quatrains, that's to say, stanzas, groups of lines of 4 lines each. There's 1 rhyme per quatrain. The second line rhymes with the 4th line. This is actually a pretty easy kind of poem to write. It's not a very aesthetically ambitious poem. The great hero of Orwell's childhood reading was a houseman, the author of the poems in A Shropshire Lad, and he uses the 4-stanza line very frequently in those poems. But he manages to do 2 rhymes per stanza, rhyming the first and third line, the second and fourth line. Orwell doesn't do that, so he makes it quite easy for himself. But it's a rather ballad-like form too, which makes sense in the sort of it complies with the democratic vision of the more political poems of the 1930s. There are the poplars that I mentioned, the posters, which Gordon sees when he goes to the door of the bookshop and looks out. And these posters, let's remember that he himself was an advertising copywriter before he became a poet. Diney usefully includes one of the legends in one of these posters, quote from the novel: "There was a picture of a horribly eupeptic family with grinning ham-pink faces sitting at breakfast underneath in blatant lettering. Why should you be thin and white and have that washed out feeling? Just take hot Bovex every night, invigorating, healing." That's the kind of poster that Gordon Comstock sees as he looks out from the bookshop. And of course, he would take a professional interest in it. So he then moves to the populace of the city of London, the clerks who hurry to the station. Note that he's not dealing here with working class people. He's dealing with office workers, with probably lower middle class guys, the clerks who commute to go home and to go into work. And what they're thinking to each other is, here comes the winter. They look towards the east, over the eastern roofs, and think, here comes the winter. That traditionally in poetry, the east is where hope comes from. The east is the site of the sunrise, of the renewal of life. But in this case, the east is where the east wind comes from. Winter is coming, to quote Game of Thrones. And this is the historical pessimism that Orwell certainly inherited from T.S. Eliot. This is the landscape of depression, of unemployment, of the age of anxiety. People thinking about the rent they have to pay, the rates they have to pay. The rates were revised in 1934. The season tickets that they have to get in order to pay for their commuting. Insurance called the skivvies wages. So these people employ somebody to clean their house, so they're not themselves at the bottom of the economic pyramid. Boots, school bills, the next installment upon the 2 twin beds from Drages. Just move on one, please, for a moment. Chris, would you? Yeah. Drages, it's not accidental that it should be Drages here. Drages was a retail furniture empire, a huge shop in London. What was significant about Drages, a very successful, thriving business, was that it was based on 2 things. It had 2, unique selling points. The first was it had very advantageous HP program, high purchase program. And that's indeed what Orwell's clerks are thinking of, the next installment they have to pay on their 2 twin beds that they bought from this shop. And secondly, Drages owed much of their success to very aggressive advertising. And again, this is something very much to the point in Keep the Aspidistra Flying. And there's an example there, which I found somewhere, and you probably may not be able to read the writing, but Mr. Drage himself features in this advertisement. He's the gentleman on the left, and he's in conversation with Mrs. Everyman, who is the customer. I can't actually read it myself, but Mr. Drage is saying to Mrs. Everyman, have you had a satisfactory experience in our shop? And she's saying to him, yes, everything was absolutely marvelous, thank you so much. And then he says, we can set up very advantageous hire purchase terms for you. Okay, so that was Drages, furnishing out of income, in other words, HP. And then could we go back one, Chris, back to the poem, thank you. Then we come to stanza 5, and this is the central stanza of the poem. As you can see, we've got 9 stanzas or verses. This is the 5th one, it's right in the middle, 4 preceding it, 4 after it. We could describe this as the hinge of the poem, where the first four close with the second four. And it's the point at which the poem does its major shift or trope, its major turn. We step back from the everyday world of London momentarily into a kind of a sort of imaginary past, a kind of mythological past. If in careless summer days, in groves of Ashtaroth we hoard. Ashtaroth is a pagan goddess. It doesn't particularly matter what her associations were, but he's talking about an imaginary past in which everything was okay, a past of pleasure and enjoyment, possibly of self-indulgence and sin. Groves of Ashtaroth we hoard. We didn't take care about the future, but now, this is where the turn is, repentant now, when winds blow cold, we kneel before our rightful Lord, the Lord of all, the money god. And if you look at, you start from the beginning of that fifth stanza, for if in careless summer days, and you can see that all the rest of the poem is a single sentence. It is a single sentence of descriptive clauses about the Lord of all, the money god. So in the past, we had a good time. We didn't have to worry about anything. Now we repent. Now winter has come. Now we have to kneel before our rightful Lord. What are his attributes? He is the Lord of all, the money god, who rules us, who gives the roof, who spies with jealous watchful care, who chills our anger, who claims his tribute, who binds with chains, and who lays the sleek estranging shield. So the whole of the rest of the poem deals with the money lord, the money god. This is capitalism, and this is where the poem enters its explicit political critique, though still a poetic one. It's a kind of blasphemy, isn't it? The money god is an almighty god and a jealous god too. He gives everything to us. He gives the roof that stops the wind, and giving takes away again. This clearly Orwell is thinking here about the biblical book of Job. Everyone remembers, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So it's a kind of blasphemous invocation of the way that the money god has replaced the Christian God as the all-powerful presence in people's lives. The money god dominates us, blood and hand and brain, as a complete authority over our lives, not just our waking lives, but our dreaming lives as well, not just our conscious lives, but our unconscious. He spies with jealous, watchful care our thoughts, our dreams, our secret ways. And you may indeed be thinking here of Big Brother and his surveillance, not only of every moment of his citizens' waking lives, but also of their sleep. Remember in 1984, I think it's Parsons, Orwell's colleague, Winston Smith's colleague, who is arrested for treason because he's been talking in his sleep about Big Brother. He's very careful to be completely orthodox during his waking hours, but he hasn't realized that Big Brother can spy into his thoughts, his dreams, his secret ways. So the money god is exercising tyranny, not only over people's economic life, but even over their private life and their inner life, over their feelings, their beliefs. This is the meaning of the word totalitarian. It is a total control. And just as in the wasteland, modernity deforms the inner life of modern citizens, so here too, there is a deformity in social and private life, which is due to the domination of the money god. He chills our anger, curbs our hope, buys our lives and pays with toys. If you like, this is consumer society. We alienate our labor, don't we? That's what he's talking about. The money god buys our lives and rewards us with things that are essentially worthless, pays with toys. And he claims as tribute broken faith, accepted insults, muted joys. We're very much here, I think, anticipating the world of Winston Smith, undergoing the tyranny of Big Brother. Another connection between this novel, this poem, and 1984. And then we get on to The last stanza, who binds with chains the poet's wit, the navvy's strength, the soldier's pride, and lays the sleek estranging shield between the lover and his bride. This was the last stanza that was achieved in that moment that we saw from the novel. The last image in the poem is an unexpected one, I think. The sleek estranging shield between the lover and his bride. This must be a reference to contraception. I don't think it can be anything else. And somehow the money god is being blamed for a deferral of fertility, if you like. It's blamed for a necessary contraception between the lover and his bride. It might remind us that in the whole novel, there has been a very strong theme, if you remember, sometimes comic theme, of sexual frustration on the part of Gordon Comstock, who spends most of the novel trying to get his girlfriend into bed. But another theme too, and that is of a lack of fertility. And this too goes back, I think, to Eliot's The Wasteland. What we're told about the Comstock family is that it is running out of fertility. It's ceasing to be able to do things. Nothing ever happened in the Comstock family. And with Gordon Comstock, the last of his line, it seems as if that Comstock heritage is soon going to run into the sand and come to nothing. So this notion of a sterility, of an inability to propagate, also something that takes us back to Eliot's The Wasteland. But also in that last stanza, the poet's wit. This is something, again, quite specific to the novel, because who is the poet? The poet is Gordon Comstock. How does the money god bind with chains the poet's wit? Well, we see this process happen in the novel. At the beginning of the novel, the most important thing to Gordon Comstock is the fact that he's a writer, he's a poet. He has to earn a living. He's been earning a living as an advertising copywriter. Now he's earning a living working in the bookshop. Later on, he will earn an even more exiguous living in other ways. But he's struggling to maintain his artistic conscience, his poetic identity. But in the end, he's going to succumb to the money god. He's going to give up being a poet. His wit is going to be voluntarily, as it seems, bound with the chains of money. And he goes back to working as a copywriter in the New Albion Advertising Agency. And that is the extremely ambiguous ending of the novel, which people might like to discuss later. I think one of the most interesting themes of the novel as a whole, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, is a theme about what language is used for. And again, just as I feel in this poem, Orwell is trying to decide what kind of a writer he wants to be, so also in the poem, there is a kind of debate, there's a sort of dialectic between, I'm sorry to use that word, let me delete it, think of something else. There's a sort of struggle between different kinds of uses of language. Next slide, please, Chris. And move on. Yeah. Here are two extracts from the novel where this idea of language and what it's for is sort of debated. And these are the two representative ways of using language, poetry and the commercial language of advertising. The octosyllables flick to and fro. Gordon Comstock is thinking now about the actual poem that we have just been reading, the octosyllabic poem, which he's composing in his head. The octosyllables flick to and fro, click, 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 click. The awful mechanical emptiness of it all appalled him. It was like some futile little machine ticking over, rhyme to rhyme, click, 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 like the nodding of a clockwork doll. Poetry, the last futility. It's when he's really losing faith in not only his own poetry, I think, but in poetry as a whole. What's it for? What's the good of it? It doesn't seem to be making any difference in the world. He's going to abandon it before the end of the novel. And then the other kind of language with which it struggles, with which it fights throughout the novel, the language of commercial advertising. The New Albion, that's the agency that he works for, with its very obviously symbolic name, right? The New Albion was one of those publicity firms which have sprung up everywhere since the war, the fungi, as you might say, that sprout from a decaying capitalism. It was a smallish, rising firm and took every class of publicity it could get. It designed a certain number of large-scale posters. Well, we've seen some of those. A certain number of large-scale posters for oatmeal stout, self-raising flour, and so forth. But its main line was millinery and cosmetic advertisements in the women's illustrated papers, besides minor ads in twopenny weeklies such as White Rose Pills for Female Disorders, Your Horoscope cast by Professor Rarotonga, The 7 Secrets of Venus, we'd all like to know what they are, New Hope for the Ruptured, Earn £5 a week in your spare time, and Ciprolax hair lotion banishes all unpleasant intruders. So which kind of language should Gordon Comstock be devoting himself to? Poetry, the last futility, or this sort of corrupt, vulgar, commercial language of advertising? And he makes his own decision at the end of the story. Okay, I'll just finish with one last question. And the question is, yeah, you could go on. I should just note that, ironically, the cover of the first edition of Keep the Aspidistra Flying is itself an advertisement, isn't it? It's an advertisement for Orwell and for his other previous books. There's a blurb there about Downert in Paris and London, clergyman's daughter about his days, and so on. My last question is this: who is the author of the poem St Andrew's Day? The same question can be asked of the poem that features in Joyce's novel Portrait of the Artist, which is written by Stephen Dedalus. Is the poem presented for our admiration? Look at this, here's a really interesting poem. Or is it part of the characterization of the central character, which would make us read it rather differently, I think, because after all, the central character in both the Joyce novel, actually, and in Orwell's novel, is a slightly ridiculous character, an immature, over-romantic, selfish narcissist. So is the poem there for its own sake, or is it there as a kind of dimension of characterization to help us understand more about Gordon Comstock himself? Orwell published his poem over his own name in the Adelphi, but in the novel, he attributes it to a poet who's something of a comical figure, the author of a collection called Mice, a petulant, spoiled, very minor poet who is in any case on the point of giving up writing poetry, the last futility. Does the novel show that poetry is futile in the face of the other language here of consumer capitalism? Is the author of St Andrew's Day George Orwell, or is it Gordon Comstock? Okay, thank you. Would you mind moving on one more, please, Chris? Okay, since this has all been about advertising, I just wanted to show you this. I haven't talked at all about Orwell and Empire, but if anyone is interested in this book, you can get a discount by quoting the promotion code at the bottom of that flyer there. So you can order it from OUP, promotion code AAFLY G6. Thank you, that's the end of my advertising. That's it. Thanks a lot, Chris, and thank you for listening.